Welcome back, ETHDenver. Next up, I'm excited to announce Justine from Optimism, who's going to be giving some interesting discussions on some DAO research. And those who don't know, obviously, Optimism's running some of the most interesting experiments right now in the DAO space. So give it a hand to Justine.
Cool. Today we're going to go over Optimism's DAO Design Principles. So I'm the governance lead at the Optimism Foundation. One of the primary goals of the Optimism Collective is to support open source public goods. So last year at ETHDenver, we open sourced some of the tools that we use in our DAO research via something we call the Collective DAO Archives. We've added new resources since last year to the archives, which we're open sourcing today. And those are the DAO blueprints and our DAO design principles. So we have to stop saying that we're building a plane while we're flying it when we talk about DAOs, because it's not really true. DAOs have been around since 2016, and there actually is a blueprint for this. Because I built them. So I mapped out the organizational blueprints for 17 DAOs. This is what Gitcoin looks like. You can see what roles were hired, when, which working groups were formed, when they were formed, how many people were part of those working groups. And you can see how this evolved over time. These are open source. You can go in and look at them in excruciating detail yourself. From this madness, though, comes a method. By doing this research, I derived 11 DAO design principles, and we actually use these in practice today at Optimism. So these are not theoretical. We're designing based on these. So we're going to go through those principles today. These are also open source, obviously, now. The first one is to use magic numbers when you're designing teams. I don't mean magic numbers in a mathematical sense, so don't at me. Magic numbers is a term used to refer to this natural limit in the number of people that can basically effectively propagate information between them. And for teams, that tends to be 7 to 14 members. When you look at DAOs, you also see a similar natural limit at around 50 full-time or almost full-time contributors. If you put those two data points together, it would imply that DAOs can support roughly 5 teams. If you look at the evolution of DAOs looking at the blueprints, you'll see that's what happens. Most DAOs evolve to a final state of 5 critical business functions. The second one is to delegate convex decisions and make concave decisions directly. This is not my framework. This is Vitalik's framework for convex versus concave decision making, but we use it a lot at Optimism. So when decisions are convex, decentralizing that decision making process can lead to confusion and low quality compromise. That's when you want to delegate those decisions to a council or a board or a small group of experts. When decisions are concave, though, they actually benefit from the wisdom of the crowd, and those should still be made by the full DAO. We have to distinguish between representatives and contributors. I talked about this last year, but it's super important, so I'm going to say it again. Representatives are delegated rights that token holders would otherwise directly execute, and they should be elected and treated as public officials, held publicly accountable. Contributors that are doing work for the DAO don't take on token holder rights and therefore don't need to be elected and held to that same level of public scrutiny. A lot of DAOs just elect all roles, and we're publicly hiring and firing everybody, which is a terrible contributor experience. It's only necessary if you're a representative. Number 4 is we want to try to design for resilience to churn, not resistance to it. So churn is inevitable, basically, in DAOs. They're inherently part-time, flexible work environments, which means they're also going to be high turnover environments. So we still want to try to retain our high context delegates, but we need to do that within a system that doesn't break if any one of them leaves. Some ways that we think about doing that is that team leads should never be a central point of failure. community roles should be spread among multiple contributors and not concentrated in one or two. Like, you can think of moderation or governance facilitators. If you only have one or two, they have a lot of power in the system. And then we have to establish talent pipelines and scalable onboarding flows so that we could replace any community leader in 7 to 14 days. Optimism's resignation policy is 7 days, so we need to be able to find a replacement in that period of time. 5, we need to avoid principal agent problems. They're everywhere in DAOs. The problem with that is that they make organizations work across us versus them lines. DAOs are already managing tenuous relationships between many different stakeholders. This exacerbates that problem. We most commonly see this in waterfall compensation schemes, but you also see it in community-led initiatives that are dependent on core teams, or when the core team is required to support community-mandated initiatives. Teams should have as much autonomy over their own operations and budgets as possible. 6 is embarrassing to have to say, but we need to make data-driven decisions. Most DAOs are not really doing this. And that can help us make fewer, better decisions. So we need to reduce the number of subjective decisions voters are asked to make, and instead empower humans to override otherwise algorithmic decisions. So what can that look like? That can look like calculations that are run over attestation graphs or formulaic strategies, and then you have smart defaults that are built on top of that, which your voters can override. We need to develop more objective frameworks, especially when it comes to economic parameters, and that is partly to reduce this natural self-preservation tendency to accrue value for the DAO at the expense of the protocol. This happens a lot, actually. This principle is the most lacking in treasury allocation strategies that are most of the time made subjectively, so there's no concept of being in a growth phase or a value phase, or when or how you adjust economic parameters. 7 is really important to optimism. We want to value outputs, not inputs. So one way we do that is to separate decision-making about the work to be done from decision-making about the team that completes it. You want to try to avoid batch proposals because that doesn't let you value any specific outputs. And then to the extent possible, we try to value work based on the output or the impact, and not on hourly or any other type of input. The impact equals profit framework goes into more detail about this concept, and it's a core part of retroactive public goods funding. It's linked here if you want to see it. Number 8 is internal redundancy creates waste, not competition. So you'll see a lot of DAOs support redundant teams, thinking it's going to promote competition and the best approach will kind of rise to the top. It's not what happens in practice. What happens in practice is these groups have overlapping responsibilities and messy handovers, and it's basically inefficient and a bad UX. It tends to go on forever also because it's super unpopular to have to fire any one of those teams via public governance vote. Nobody wants to do that. What works much better are competitive, basically RFP processes, where you have multiple external teams competing for the ability to complete a piece of work. And that's because it creates healthy competition via performance-based accountability. Scope should be narrow, not broad. Most working group mandates in DAOs are super broad, and the problem with that is that it creates room for inefficient budgeting and also sometimes fraud because the ambiguity reduces accountability. You see sometimes like meta work streams, which is where you have multiple working groups within a larger work stream that represents the function. That doesn't usually work because it introduces additional coordination costs when coordination costs are already high in decentralized environments. For the same reason, you don't usually see cross-functional working groups. So the thing to remember is to keep scopes, mandates, RFPs, whatever, as narrowly scoped as possible. This one was one of the more interesting findings from the research I did, and that was that you want to scale work within the DAO via public goods rather than public services, and I'll explain what I mean. You can imagine like a data team or a data working group that provides data services to other teams within the DAO, that suffers from diseconomies of scale, and also like a variation of the principal agent problem where the DAO approves the budget for that team, but the individual groups consume the services. What works a lot better, though, is if that same data team within the DAO provides like public data infrastructure that the other teams can use to conduct their own analytics. So that's what I mean by public goods, public infrastructure versus public services. This is the last one. So we want to try to achieve alignment through action. A lot of DAOs create structures without any consideration for what the strategic objectives of those structures are, and then retroactively try to align or justify the DAO's efforts. Usually attempts at strategic alignment are made via paper policy, and the problem with that is it results in bureaucracy, not alignment. Instead, we want to try to design systems that in which merely taking action is inherently aligned. So it's hard to do, but I can give an example. So paper policy approach would be having everybody grade proposals on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how much they align with a stated goal. A more inherently aligned system would be to allocate each strategic goal a budget and then have people rank order initiatives under them. So just by casting a vote, there's no way it can't be strategically aligned. So why are we open sourcing these, and why do the principles matter? Well, because we're actually not just open sourcing these resources, we're open sourcing everything. And what I mean by everything is the entire governance design process at Optimism. So this is the first step in a gradual path towards open meta-governance. Right now, we're in phase 0, which is to open source the thinking of the foundation and the design team by sharing resources, goals, milestones, the collective archives, so that we can build shared context with the governance participants. Phase 1, which will happen shortly, will be to establish or formalize a feedback panel of high context governance participants so they can start to provide feedback during the design process. Right now we get feedback after designs are more or less complete. We will start to have governance participants involved during the design process. Phase 2 would be that feedback panel evolves into a contribution path where it's an open process and like kind of training to do meta-governance design. And then the final phase of this is that contribution path turns into a concept we're introducing called core delegates. And much in the same way that core developers develop and evolve the core protocol, core delegates would maintain, develop, and evolve the core governance system through meta-governance proposal rights. So there's more details on this path. It's going to be experimental like everything we do and open to your feedback, but you can read the full forum post, which is linked here. And if you haven't already joined the collective, you can register to be a delegate. Anybody, whether or not you're involved in our ecosystem, can use the Collective DAO Archives. They're open source public good that are free for anybody to use. And they were also made using entirely public information.